The morning sun had barely risen over JFK International Airport when Officer James Reynolds pulled into the employee parking lot in his old Honda Civic. The car made a tired sound as he turned off the engine, matching how he felt inside. He sat there for a moment, looking at the small photo of his daughter tucked into the sun visor. It had been 3 months since he had last seen her, thanks to the messy divorce with his ex-wife Sarah. Running his fingers through his graying hair, Reynolds checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of another sleepless night. At 45 years old, he looked older than he should, worn down by 18 years of police work and a marriage that had fallen apart. Another day, another dollar, he muttered to himself, grabbing his duffel bag from the passenger seat. The morning air was crisp, and the sound of planes taking off filled the sky above him. As he walked toward the airport's employee entrance, he could already see that something was different about today. The drop-off area was more crowded than usual, with a line of cars stretching farther than he had seen in months. Inside the airport, the situation was even worse. The main terminal looked like a small city had moved in overnight. Hundreds of passengers stood in lines that twisted and turned like snakes. Reynolds spotted his colleague, Officer Maria Chen, directing traffic near the security checkpoint. "What's going on?" he asked her as he approached. Maria wiped sweat from her forehead. 3 flights got cancelled last night because of bad weather in Chicago. Then 2 more this morning had technical problems. We've got almost 1,000 extra people trying to rebook their flights. Reynolds groaned. He hadn't even started his shift, and he could already feel a headache coming on. He made his way to the staff locker room, where he changed into his uniform. As he pinned his badge to his chest, his phone buzzed. It was another email from his lawyer about the custody battle for his daughter, Emily. His ex-wife wanted to move to California with their little girl, and the thought of being that far from Emily made his stomach turn. He slammed the locker door harder than he meant to, making other officers in the room jump. "Sorry," he mumbled, embarrassed by his lack of control. His supervisor had already warned him about his temper last week when he had gotten too aggressive with a drunk passenger. The morning briefing was short but tense. They were understaffed today, with 3 officers out sick. Reynolds was assigned to Terminal 4, which handled many international flights. As he walked to his post, he passed by the airport's large windows. Private jets and commercial planes sat on the tarmac like giant birds, while ground crews scurried around them like ants. His radio crackled to life. "All units be advised. We have reports of a group of teenagers causing disruption near Gate B7. Any available officers, please respond." Reynolds touched his radio. Unit 247 responding. He changed direction, walking briskly toward Gate B7. Around him, the airport was getting more crowded by the minute. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the mass of bodies, and the noise level had risen to a constant roar of voices, rolling suitcases, and airport announcements in multiple languages. As he pushed through the crowd, Reynolds felt the weight of his personal problems pressing down on him. The divorce had taken all his savings. He had moved into a small apartment that felt empty without Emily's toys scattered around. His ex-wife's lawyers were making his life difficult, and the custody battle was getting uglier every week. He reached Gate B7 just as his radio came alive again. "Attention all units. Be advised we have unconfirmed reports of unauthorized access in restricted areas. Maintain heightened awareness." Reynolds straightened his back and scanned the crowd with tired but alert eyes. Something about today felt different, unsettled. After 18 years on the job, he had developed a kind of sixth sense for trouble, and right now, that sense was telling him that this was going to be more than just another ordinary day at JFK International Airport. Little did Officer James Reynolds know, his next decision would not only change his life forever, but would also create an international crisis that would make headlines around the world. At exactly 9:47 a.m., a sleek black private jet landed on JFK's private runway. The control tower staff looked at each other in confusion. This flight wasn't on their schedule. Someone had made a big mistake in the diplomatic channels, and now an unannounced plane carrying one of the world's most controversial leaders had just touched down on American soil. Inside the jet, Kim Jong sat in his leather chair, looking out the small window at the American airport. He was dressed in a simple black suit instead of his usual military-style outfit. This secret trip to New York was supposed to be the first step in private peace talks with certain American officials. Only 5 people in his government knew about this visit. Supreme Leader, his trusted translator, Mr. Park, spoke quietly in Korean. I do not feel well. The man's face had turned pale, and sweat ran down his forehead. He had been fighting food poisoning for the last 2 hours of the flight, trying to hide his discomfort. Kim Jong-un frowned. This was not part of the plan. Mr. Park was not just his translator. He was one of the few people who knew the complete details of today's secret meeting. Looking at the sick man, Kim made a quick decision. He would have to enter the airport alone and meet his American contact without a translator. The risk of using an unknown translator was too high for such a secret mission. Rest here, Kim ordered Mr. Park in Korean. I will handle this myself. He had studied English in his younger years and understood basic phrases, though he rarely spoke it in public. The plane's door opened, and the warm morning air rushed in. Usually, Kim would exit with his full security team, but today he needed to be discreet. 2 of his guards, dressed as businessmen, would follow him at a distance. The rest would stay with the plane. As Kim walked down the airplane steps, he felt strangely normal without his usual parade of guards. The morning sun felt warm on his face, and for a moment, he almost enjoyed the feeling of being just another traveler. He had memorized the instructions. Go through the private terminal, take the secure corridor to gate C3, where his American contact would be waiting. But nothing was going as planned. The private terminal was unexpectedly closed for renovations. Another detail lost in the diplomatic confusion. A young airport worker, not recognizing the North Korean leader in his simple suit, directed him toward the main terminal through a series of back corridors. Kim tried to remember the English words to ask for directions, but his pride held him back. He had always appeared strong and all-knowing in public. Now, walking through the busy American airport, he felt out of place. His 2 hidden guards had fallen behind, stuck behind a large group of tourists. The signs on the walls were confusing. Kim found himself in a restricted area, trying to find his way to gate C3. The corridor was quiet except for the distant sound of airplane engines. He checked his special phone, hoping for a message from his American contact, but there was nothing. Suddenly, a loud voice called out behind him in English, "Hey, you can't be here." Kim turned slowly, his face showing no emotion, just as he had been trained since childhood. An American police officer was walking toward him quickly. Kim understood the words but wasn't sure how to explain his situation without revealing his identity. He stood still, thinking about his next move. The officer's face was red with anger, and he was speaking too fast for Kim to understand. In his earpiece, Kim could hear his guards trying to reach his location, but they were still too far away. He thought about showing his diplomatic papers, but they were in Korean, and revealing them might expose his secret mission. The situation was getting worse by the second. The officer was now just a few feet away, his hand resting on his belt. Kim tried to remember the English words for diplomatic meeting, or private visit, but his mind went blank. Years of being surrounded by people who jumped at his every command had not prepared him for this moment. As the angry officer got closer, Kim realized that his perfect plan had fallen apart in less than 15 minutes on American soil. The next few seconds would either ruin everything or somehow save the secret mission. But without his translator, without his usual power, and without his army of guards, the supreme leader of North Korea was about to learn just how quickly a small misunderstanding could turn into an international incident. Officer Reynolds was having the worst morning of his career. The teenagers at Gate B7 had scattered before he arrived, leaving behind a mess of spilled sodas and overturned chairs. His shoes were sticky from cleaning up, his temper was rising, and now he had found an unauthorized person in a restricted area. The man was short, with an unusual haircut, wearing an expensive-looking black suit that seemed too warm for the weather. I said, "This is a restricted area." Reynolds shouted again, his patience wearing thin. The man just stood there, staring at him with an unnervingly calm expression. Something about that calm made Reynolds even angrier. Here he was, having the day from hell, and this guy was acting like he owned the place. The stranger finally spoke, saying something in what sounded like Korean. Reynolds had dealt with foreign travelers before, but today he wasn't in the mood for charads. ID and papers now. He demanded, making exaggerated gestures for show me and documents. Kim Jong-un understood the gesture but hesitated. His diplomatic papers were hidden in a secret pocket, but showing them would expose his identity. He tried to remember the English words he had learned years ago. Meeting. Important. He managed to say, pointing toward gate C3. Reynolds stepped closer, his face red with frustration. The response made no sense to him. In his earpiece, he could hear reports of more disturbances in other terminals. The whole airport felt like it was descending into chaos, and now this stubborn man was refusing to comply with simple instructions. "Sir, this is your last warning," Reynolds said slowly and loudly, as if volume would break through the language barrier. "Show me your ID, or you're coming with me to security." He reached for the man's arm, intending to escort him to the security office. Kim instinctively pulled away from the officer's grip. In North Korea, no one dared to touch him without permission. He took a step back and raised his hand in a stopping gesture, saying something sharply in Korean. His face showed the first signs of anger. For Officer Reynolds, that raised hand was the last straw. His training kicked in, but it was clouded by stress, lack of sleep, and the morning's frustrations. The man's resistance and what looked like an aggressive gesture triggered his worst instincts. In a split second, years of professional training gave way to raw emotion. Reynolds threw a punch. Time seemed to slow down. His fist connected with Kim Jong-un's jaw with a solid thud. The North Korean leader's head snapped back, his eyes wide with shock. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, someone had struck him. The supreme leader of North Korea stumbled backward, catching himself against the wall. The sound of running feet filled the corridor. Reynolds had just enough time to feel the first wave of regret when suddenly the air was filled with shouts in Korean and English. Men in suits seemed to appear from nowhere, weapons drawn. Two grabbed Reynolds, slamming him face first into the wall. Others formed a protective circle around Kim, who was touching his jaw with an expression of disbelief. A tall Korean man in a gray suit brushed forward, speaking rapidly in Korean to Kim. Then he turned to Reynolds, his face pale with horror. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked in perfect English. "You just assaulted the supreme leader of North Korea." Reynolds felt his stomach drop. The words hit him harder than any punch could have. His mind raced back through the last few minutes, replaying every action, every mistake, the mysterious man's calm demeanor, the expensive suit, the way he carried himself. It all made terrible sense now. More security personnel were flooding the corridor. Reynolds heard his radio crackling with urgent messages, but they seemed far away. As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he caught a glimpse of Kim Jong-un being hurried away by his security team. The North Korean leader's face had already started to swell, and his eyes burned with an anger that promised serious consequences. Officer James Reynolds had just started an international incident with a single punch, and as he was led away, he knew with crushing certainty that his life would never be the same again. The next 30 minutes at JFK International Airport felt like a scene from an action movie. Alarms blared through every terminal. Security teams ran through corridors. Confused passengers pressed their faces against windows, trying to understand why dozens of black SUVs were suddenly surrounding a private jet on the tarmac. In a small security office, Officer Reynolds sat handcuffed to a chair, staring at the floor. His police badge lay on the desk in front of him, next to his phone, which wouldn't stop buzzing with messages. Two FBI agents stood guard at the door, while a third typed rapidly on a laptop, sending urgent reports to Washington. "I didn't know," Reynolds kept saying to anyone who would listen. "How was I supposed to know?" But no one answered him. The senior officers who had known him for years now looked at him like he was a stranger. Even Maria Chen, his friend from the morning shift, had turned away when they brought him in. Meanwhile, in a private lounge on the other side of the airport, Kim Jong-un sat in a large leather chair, holding an ice pack to his jaw. His security team had transformed the room into a temporary command center. Phones rang constantly, and urgent messages flew between Pyongyang and Washington. The secret diplomatic mission was now the biggest news story in the world. Mr. Park, Kim's translator, had recovered enough from his illness to join his leader. "Supreme Leader," he said in Korean, bowing deeply, "I take full responsibility for this failure. If I had not been sick." Kim raised his hand, stopping Mr. Park mid-sentence. The North Korean leader's face was starting to show a dark bruise where Reynolds' fist had connected. In his entire life, no one had ever dared to strike him. Even as a child, when other boys fought in school, everyone knew not to touch the future leader. Now, in just a few seconds, an American police officer had shattered that lifetime of untouchability. Outside the lounge, chaos was spreading through the airport. Someone had recorded the incident on their phone, and the video was already going viral on social media. Passengers crowded around their phones, watching the grainy footage of a police officer punching a man in a suit, followed by the dramatic revelation of who that man was. News helicopters appeared in the sky above JFK, circling like hungry birds. Reporters gathered at every airport entrance, pushing microphones at anyone who walked out. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it. Back in the security office, Reynolds watched as a large TV on the wall showed his face on every news channel. CNN, Fox News, BBC, they'd all had the same headlines scrolling across the screen. American police officer assaults North Korean leader and international crisis at JFK Airport. My daughter, Reynolds suddenly said, his voice cracking. Someone needs to pick up my daughter from school. The reporters will go there. She can't. His voice broke off as a new wave of panic hit him. 9-year-old Emily would be finishing school in a few hours, completely unaware that her father had just become the center of an international incident. The FBI agent with the laptop looked up. For the first time since this started, someone showed Reynolds a bit of sympathy. We'll take care of it, the agent said quietly. We'd already sent people to protect your family. Protect. The word hit Reynolds hard. His family needed protection because of what he'd done, because he had lost his temper, because he had thrown a punch without thinking. A new group of people entered the security office. They wore expensive suits and carried diplomatic credentials. One of them, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, walked straight to Reynolds. I'm from the State Department, she said, her voice tense. And you, Officer Reynolds, have just created the biggest diplomatic crisis this country has faced in years. She paused, looking at her phone as another message came in. Her face got even more serious. North Korea has just released an official statement. They're calling this an act of war. She turned back to Reynolds, who felt the room spinning around him. The next 24 hours will determine whether we can prevent this incident from escalating into something much, much worse. Reynolds closed his eyes, wishing he could wake up from this nightmare. But the handcuffs around his wrists reminded him that this was very real, and it was only going to get worse. By sunset, the incident at JFK Airport had turned into a global crisis. In New York, the United Nations building was surrounded by news vans. In Washington, the White House press room was packed with reporters from every country. And in North Korea, massive crowds filled the streets of Pyongyang, waving angry signs in both Korean and English. The viral video of the punch had been watched over 50 million times. People couldn't stop sharing it. The quick punch, Kim Jong-un stumbling backward, the shocked faces of everyone involved. Social media exploded with memes and jokes, but government officials weren't laughing. Inside the White House Situation Room, the president sat at a long table surrounded by his top advisors. The room was tense, with dozens of screens showing news coverage from around the world. One screen displayed a live satellite image of North Korea, where military units were suddenly very active. What exactly are we dealing with? The president asked, rubbing his tired eyes. The Secretary of State stepped forward with a tablet. North Korea has issued 3 statements in the last hour, she reported. They're calling it an act of deliberate aggression and a declaration of war. They've closed their borders, recalled their diplomats, and put their military on high alert. On the other side of the world, Kim Jong-un's private jet sat on the tarmac at JFK, surrounded by security. Inside, the North Korean leader was on a secure video call with his military commanders. His jaw had swollen considerably, and the bruise had turned a dark purple. Photos of his injured face had been broadcast on North Korean state TV, making the situation even worse. The American government claims this was just a mistake by one police officer, Kim's top general said through the video feed. They said he didn't recognize you. But our people are angry, Supreme Leader. They demand action. Kim touched his swollen jaw carefully. Part of him knew this could be used to North Korea's advantage, but his pride had been hurt more than his face. In his country, he was treated like a god. Now, millions had watched him get punched by an American cop. Back in Washington, things were getting worse. China had issued a statement supporting North Korea. Russia was moving military ships closer to the Korean peninsula. Japan and South Korea were asking for emergency meetings with U.S. officials. The stock market was dropping as fears of war grew. The president's phone rang. It was the South Korean president, the third world leader, to call in the last hour. "You need to fix this," he said urgently. "Kim Jong-un losing face like this. It's the worst possible situation. You can't just ignore it. It has to respond somehow." At the United Nations, emergency meetings were being held. Diplomats rushed through the halls with urgent messages. Countries that normally didn't talk to each other were suddenly in deep discussion. Everyone had the same fear. Could one punch really start a war? Social media wasn't helping. Hashtag World War III was trending on Twitter. TikTok was full of videos analyzing the punch from every angle. Some people made jokes, others panicked and posted about building bunkers. Fake news spread quickly, with false reports of military movements and secret attacks. The situation got even more tense when North Korean state TV released a new video. It showed massive military parades in Pyongyang, with soldiers marching and missiles being driven through the streets. The message was clear: North Korea was ready for war. In the White House Situation Room, a young aide rushed in with new satellite photos. They showed North Korean missile launchers being moved out of their storage bunkers. Everyone in the room fell silent. The president stood up, looking at all the chaos unfolding on the screens around him. "Get me someone who can talk to Kim Jong-un directly," he ordered. "And find out everything you can about this police officer. His background, his family, everything. We need to find a way to fix this before it gets even worse." As night fell on the East Coast, the world held its breath. One small incident at an airport had pushed two nuclear powers to the brink of conflict. And somewhere in a secure location, Officer James Reynolds watched it all unfold on TV, knowing he had accidentally become the man who might have started World War III. 3 days after the incident, Officer James Reynolds sat in a small safe house somewhere in upstate New York. FBI agents had moved him here after people started throwing rocks at his apartment windows. The modest two-bedroom house was comfortable enough, but it felt like a prison. He wasn't allowed to leave, use his phone, or contact anyone except through approved channels. The TV in the corner was showing his old high school yearbook photo. Reynolds watched as news anchors discussed his life story like he was some kind of criminal mastermind. James Reynolds, age 45, divorced father of one, a reporter said. Former high school wrestling champion, 18 years on the police force, and now the man who might have started World War III. His daughter Emily was staying with his sister in another protected location. The FBI had shown him a video of her yesterday. She was trying to be brave, but he could see how scared she was. At school, other kids had started calling her the war starter's daughter. The video had ended with Emily asking one simple question: "When can I see Dad again?" Reynolds got up and walked to the window. 2 armed guards stood outside, but they weren't there to keep him in. They were there to protect him from the angry protesters who kept trying to find him. His inbox was full of death threats. Some people called him a traitor, others called him a hero. A few crazy people even wanted him to run for president. "Mr. Reynolds," a voice called from behind him. A young government lawyer named Sarah Chen had arrived for their daily meeting. She carried a thick folder and looked tired. "We need to talk about the charges." Reynolds sat back down, feeling sick to his stomach. The list of charges against him seemed to grow every day: assault, diplomatic violations, reckless endangerment. The words all blurred together. Some politicians wanted him arrested for treason. Others said he should be sent to North Korea to face charges there. "Your union lawyer quit this morning," Sarah said, opening her folder. "He said it's too high profile, but we found someone else who's willing to take your case." She paused, looking at her notes. "The good news is that the security video proves you didn't know who he was. The bad news is, well, everything else." Reynolds nodded silently. His whole career, all his years of service, reduced to one terrible moment. The department had fired him immediately. His pension was gone. His savings were being eaten up by legal fees. Even if he somehow avoided jail time, his life as he knew it was over. The TV switched to footage from North Korea. Millions of people were marching through Pyongyang, carrying pictures of Kim Jong-un's bruised face. Signs in English read, punish the criminal Reynolds and justice for our supreme leader. Your ex-wife's lawyers called again, Sarah continued. They're using this incident to push for full custody of Emily. They're saying your anger issues make you an unfit father. That was the thing that finally broke him. Reynolds put his head in his hands and started crying. All the stress, fear, and guilt of the past 3 days came pouring out. Sarah awkwardly patted his shoulder, then handed him a tissue. Look, she said kindly, it's not all bad news. Some people actually support what you did. There's a GoFundMe page for your legal defense that's raised over $2 million. Hashtag Team Reynolds is trending on Twitter, and you got marriage proposals coming in from all over the country. Reynolds laughed bitterly through his tears. Great, I can get married again if I'm not in prison or dead from nuclear war. Sarah was about to respond when her phone buzzed. She looked at it and her eyes went wide. The White House just called. They want to talk to you directly. Something about a possible solution. She started gathering her papers quickly. A car will be here in 20 minutes to pick you up. Reynolds stood up, his legs shaking slightly. First a police officer, then an international incident, and now he was heading to the White House. As he went to change his clothes, he wondered what else this nightmare had in store for him. At least it couldn't get any worse, or could it? The Oval Office was quieter than Reynolds had expected. He sat nervously on an expensive couch, surrounded by the most powerful people in America. The president stood by his desk, reading messages on a secure tablet. The Secretary of State paced back and forth, talking quietly on a phone. Everyone was waiting for one important call. Finally, a red phone on the president's desk rang. The room fell silent as he answered it. Mr. Kim, the president said carefully, thank you for taking my call. On a large screen on the wall, Kim Jong-un's face appeared. His bruise had turned a yellowish-green color. Mr. Park, now recovered from his illness, stood beside him to translate. Reynolds tried to make himself smaller on the couch, but Kim's eyes found him immediately. The North Korean people demand justice, Kim said through his translator. His voice was calm but firm. This insult cannot go unanswered. The president nodded. We understand. That's why we developed a proposal we think might satisfy both sides. He gestured to his advisors, who started passing out documents to everyone in the room. The plan was unusual. Officer Reynolds would travel to North Korea. He would make a public apology in front of the Korean people. In return, North Korea would receive certain trade benefits they had been wanting for years. It was a way for both countries to save face. Reynolds looked at the document in his hands, his mouth dry. I have to go to North Korea. The thought terrified him. He had seen the angry crowds on TV, the burning effigies of himself. What if they arrest me as soon as I land? The Secretary of State stepped forward. We've negotiated very specific terms. You'll have diplomatic immunity. The visit will last exactly 6 hours. Everything will be televised live to prevent any mishaps. She looked at him seriously. Mr. Reynolds, this might be our only chance to prevent a war. On the screen, Kim Jong-un was reading the same proposal. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes moved quickly over the pages. Mr. Park whispered additional explanations in Korean. The minutes ticked by in tense silence. Reynolds thought about Emily, about the protesters outside his house, about the possibility of war. Finally, he spoke up. I'll do it, he said quietly. I'll go to North Korea. Kim looked up from the proposal. Through his translator, he said, the policeman agrees so quickly. Why? Reynolds stood up, his legs shaking slightly. Looking directly at the screen, he said, because I have a daughter. Because I made a mistake. And because I don't want my daughter to grow up in a world that went to war because of that mistake. For the first time since the incident, something changed in Kim's expression. He asked a question in Korean, and Mr. Park translated. Your daughter? How old? 9, Reynolds answered. Her name is Emily. Kim was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made Mr. Park's eyes widen in surprise. The translator carefully repeated Kim's words. I accept the proposal, but with one addition. When Officer Reynolds comes to Pyongyang, you'll bring his daughter. My own father took me to diplomatic events at her age. It taught me important lessons about leadership and responsibility. The American officials looked at each other in shock. This was completely unexpected. Reynolds started to protest. He couldn't put Emily in danger, but the Secretary of State grabbed his arm. "This is perfect," she whispered. "Think about it. They can't harm you if your daughter is there. And it humanizes the whole situation. Both sides save face, and the media will love it." The president quickly agreed to the new terms. Within minutes, officials on both sides were working out the details. Guards, translators, security protocols. Everything had to be perfect. As Reynolds left the Oval Office that evening, his mind was spinning. In just 3 days, he would be flying to North Korea with his daughter. From police officer to international criminal to diplomatic envoy, his life had become stranger than any movie. That night, as he was driven back to the safe house, Reynolds practiced what he would say to Emily. How do you tell a 9-year-old girl that she's going to meet the man her father punched, and that meeting might be the only thing preventing a war? The Great Hall in Pyongyang was packed with people and cameras. Huge red banners hung from the ceiling, and important-looking officials filled the front rows. James Reynolds stood at the podium, wearing a new suit provided by the State Department. His daughter Emily sat in the front row, looking tiny in her blue dress next to the American diplomats protecting her. This was the moment the whole world had been waiting for. Every major TV network was broadcasting live. Social media had crashed twice already from people trying to watch the stream. Even the protests had stopped as everyone waited to see what would happen. Reynolds looked down at his prepared speech, his hands shaking slightly. But before he could start speaking, something unexpected happened. Kim Jong-un raised his hand, stopping the proceedings. Through Mr. Park, he said something that surprised everyone. "Before you apologize," the translator conveyed Kim's words, "I wish to speak with you privately. Just us, our translators, and," he pointed to Emily, "your daughter." The American diplomats started to protest, but Kim had already stood up. He gestured for Reynolds and Emily to follow him into a smaller room off the main hall. News cameras tried to follow but were stopped at the door. Inside, the room was simple but elegant, with just a few chairs and a small table. Emily held her father's hand tightly as they sat down. Kim Jong-un sat across from them, his face still showing the fading bruise. Mr. Park stood ready to translate. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Kim did something that shocked everyone. He smiled. "Your daughter," he said through the translator. "She looks scared. Please tell her she has nothing to fear." Reynolds squeezed Emily's hand. "It's okay, honey," he whispered. "We're just going to talk." Kim leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. Reynolds, do you know why I wanted your daughter to come today?" When Reynolds shook his head, Kim continued. "Because children see truth that adults often miss. Emily, what did you think when you saw the video of your father punching me?" Emily looked up at her dad, then at Kim. In a small voice, she said, "I thought everybody made mistakes. Dad always tells me that what matters is how you fix them." Mr. Park translated this, and for a moment, Kim Jong-un looked genuinely surprised. He asked another question, "And what do you think should happen now?" Emily thought for a moment. I think you both probably wish that day never happened. And maybe you could be friends instead of being angry." When these words were translated, something remarkable happened. Kim Jong-un laughed. Not an angry laugh, but a genuine one. He said something long in Korean, and Mr. Park carefully translated. "Your daughter is wise beyond her years, Mr. Reynolds. She is right. This incident has been educational for me. In my country, no one has dared to touch me since I was a child. Perhaps I needed to remember what it feels like to be treated like an ordinary person." Reynolds couldn't believe what he was hearing. Kim continued, "I have decided to turn this unfortunate incident into something positive. Today, you will still apologize. The world expects it. But afterward, I will announce new diplomatic talks with America. We will use this moment to build bridges, not start wars." Tears formed in Reynolds' eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry for what happened. I really didn't know." Kim held up his hand, stopping him. "Save it for the cameras," he said through the translator, smiling slightly. "But know this, your punch may have done what years of diplomacy could not. Sometimes it takes a mistake to create an opportunity." They returned to the Great Hall, where Reynolds gave his prepared apology, but it didn't feel forced anymore. When he finished, Kim Jong-un stood up and shocked the world by walking over and shaking his hand. Cameras flashed frantically as the two men smiled at each other. Later that night, on the flight back to America, Emily fell asleep with her head on her father's shoulder. Reynolds looked out the airplane window at the lights below, thinking about how differently things had turned out. He had lost his job and his old life, but somehow he had helped create peace instead of war. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from the State Department. They wanted him to consider a new job in diplomatic relations. Reynolds smiled, looking at his sleeping daughter. Sometimes the biggest mistakes led to the most unexpected opportunities.